Tonight, many of America's farmers already feeling the pinch are worried about the possibility of more challenges.
Because I know how hard this is going to be for a lot of people.
For generations, American wheat carried a quiet but formidable influence in the global food system. It was not the sort of commodity that made front-page headlines or triggered political theatrics. Its power lay in consistency. Cargo ships gliding out of U.S. ports on schedule, grain arriving in foreign mills exactly as contracted, bakeries across continents producing bread, pasta, and pastries with flour that buyers trusted implicitly. Farmers across the Midwest built their livelihoods on that reliability. The world counted on American wheat, and for decades it seemed unshakable. But in recent years, a slow and silent shift began to take root. One not marked by dramatic announcements or sudden collapses, but by a series of subtle changes that together have redrawn the global wheat trade. It started with contracts slipping quietly into the hands of competitors. Buyers, once loyal, began exploring alternative suppliers. Shipping routes that had long been predictable veered toward unfamiliar ports. The unraveling wasn't immediately obvious, but its impact is now undeniable. The question echoing from rural Kansas to international grain exchanges is stark. What happened to American wheat, and why is it happening now? The change first stirred in places far from the political spotlight: small ports, quiet silos, and rural grain elevators. Farmers began to notice shipments canceled without explanation. Warehouses brimmed with unsold harvests. In some areas, crops sat in the field long past their prime, uncut because there was nowhere to send them. The bedrock certainty that somewhere someone would always buy American grain was no longer a given. A few farmers facing insurmountable storage costs and dwindling prospects made choices they never imagined, destroying their own harvest to avoid watching it rot. One of the earliest fractures appeared not in some distant market, but in a neighbor with whom the U.S. had traded for generations: Mexico. For decades, Mexican importers had been steady, buying millions of tons annually. The relationship was built on geography, volume, and trust. Yet by mid-2025, shipments from the United States to Mexico had fallen nearly 40% from the previous year. Canadian wheat quickly filled the gap, its exports to Mexico soaring by more than a third. Argentina joined in, expanding its own share. The reason stretched far beyond simple price competition. Mexican buyers had grown weary of unpredictability. Tariff adjustments issued without warning, sudden changes to export paperwork, and delays at border crossings in Texas that left entire shipments idling in costly limbo. Those delays rippled down the supply chain, raising food prices for Mexican consumers. In contrast, Canadian suppliers offered a smoother experience: consistent terms, flawless documentation, and timely arrivals. Manitoba grain facilities had even been upgraded to meet Mexico's specific inspection standards, ensuring cargo cleared quickly. By the close of the second quarter, Canadian wheat flows to Mexico had jumped 37%, while U.S. blending plants near the border shuttered and American farmers slashed prices by up to 20% in a bid to cling to market share. The orders kept dwindling. Across the Atlantic, another long-standing partnership was eroding. France, whose bakeries had long prized the strength and texture of American hard wheat for everything from airy baguettes to the delicate layers of a croissant, began to turn away. By the summer of 2025, U.S. shipments to France had fallen to their lowest level in over 2 decades. French mills sought alternatives from Canada and in some cases reverted to local production, despite a disappointing harvest year. Price wasn't the problem, reliability was. U.S. shipments increasingly arrived late. Inconsistent adherence to environmental standards triggered costly customs delays. Some cargoes contained chemical residues exceeding European limits, raising red flags among regulators. The fear wasn't just of bad wheat, it was of shipments that might fail inspection entirely. In this environment, Canadian suppliers moved decisively. Within a year, they expanded their European market share by over 40%, investing in automation for quality checks, real-time tracking for shipments, and transparent carbon footprint reporting. For European importers under pressure to prove supply chain integrity, this certainty was invaluable. By the time Canadian grain was feeding bakeries across Paris, Lyon, and Marseille, the transition felt less like a shift than a completed handover. In Asia, the collapse was faster and more dramatic. South Korea had been a loyal buyer for nearly 40 years, relying on U.S. wheat for staples like ramen noodles, packaged breads, and pastries. The supply chain was almost symbiotic, factories and recipes tailored to the specific characteristics of American grain. But between late 2024 and mid-2025, U.S. market share in South Korea fell from over one-third to less than 17%. The turning point came when Seoul tightened restrictions on glyphosate, a widely used herbicide. American wheat routinely tested between 200 and 400 parts per billion, well above South Korea's new limits. By contrast, Canadian and Australian wheat tested between 30 and 70. For Korean buyers, the calculus was simple. One option carried higher insurance costs, extra testing, and the risk of rejection at port. The other met the standard immediately with full digital traceability. By June, U.S. wheat was all but gone from the docks of Busan and Incheon. Canadian shipments, meanwhile, moved seamlessly through customs. Canadian producers had prepared meticulously, developing durum varieties with ideal cooking textures, synchronizing shipments with factory schedules, and embedding inspections into the delivery process itself. Major Korean food manufacturers stopped discussing the U.S. as a sourcing option altogether. Even in Italy, where pasta making is as much an art form as an industry, the shift was underway. For years, durum wheat from the American Midwest had been prized for its elasticity and cooking performance. But when Canadian grain began arriving on time, at quality, and without the risk of political or regulatory disruption, the choice became easier. In cities like Bologna and Naples, the flour feeding the pasta industry increasingly came from Saskatchewan, not South Dakota. Perhaps the earliest and clearest sign of the U.S.'s eroding grip came from the Philippines. For decades, the archipelago imported roughly 3 million tons of wheat annually, with as much as 90% sourced from the U.S. That trust began to unravel in May 2025, when a leading milling company abruptly canceled a 12,000-ton American order, replacing it days later with a contract for 110,000 tons from Canada and Australia. Even though U.S. wheat remained $8 to $10 per ton cheaper, price no longer outweighed risk. Delays were becoming routine. Insurance premiums were rising. Political uncertainty in Washington made importers wary. Every U.S. shipment seemed to carry the potential for disruption. In the American heartland, the effects were brutal. Freight volumes slowed. Inland ports reported fewer departures. Storage facilities in Kansas and Nebraska filled far beyond seasonal norms, with some silos holding inventories 40% higher than the year before. Stricter immigration rules left fewer workers to handle the grain. In some cases, crops were left unharvested. In others, farmers burned unsold grain rather than let it decay. By mid-2025, the pattern was unmistakable. From Mexico to France, South Korea to the Philippines, buyers were choosing not the cheapest supplier, but the most dependable. And increasingly, that meant looking north to Canada. The erosion of U.S. wheat dominance was not born of a single policy failure or a momentary lapse in trade diplomacy. It was the product of years of incremental shifts, political decisions, regulatory missteps, and market complacency that accumulated into something far greater than the sum of their parts. By the time many in Washington began to notice, the damage had already spread across continents. At the core of the problem was a breakdown in reliability. For decades, U.S. agriculture had been underpinned by a simple equation: consistent quality plus predictable delivery equaled enduring trust. But that formula had begun to fracture. Domestic policy swings, abrupt tariff changes, shifting environmental enforcement, and fluctuating export rules introduced a layer of uncertainty that foreign buyers could not ignore. What had once been an occasional annoyance became a recurring obstacle. Tariff adjustments were particularly corrosive. In some cases, they were announced with little or no lead time, catching exporters mid-contract. Buyers who had budgeted for one price suddenly faced an unexpected surcharge, or worse, delays as paperwork was recalculated. Even when tariffs were eventually rescinded or exemptions granted, the perception of instability lingered. Overseas importers, especially in regions where food security was politically sensitive, began factoring that risk into every decision. Border delays compounded the problem. The U.S.-Mexico border, long a symbol of agricultural interdependence, had become a bottleneck. Heightened inspections and inconsistent staffing meant perishable shipments could be held for days. Grain might not spoil like fresh produce, but the ripple effects were costly. Warehousing fees, missed processing schedules, and disrupted distribution chains. And in global commodities markets, reputational damage spreads quickly. One missed delivery can tarnish years of dependable service. Environmental compliance added another layer of complication. While many U.S. producers adhered to rigorous standards, lapses were not uncommon. A shipment containing chemical residues above a trading partner's limit could be rejected outright, setting off a bureaucratic scramble to find alternative buyers or reroute cargo. European importers, who faced mounting regulatory pressure to prove the sustainability of their supply chains, were especially unforgiving. Canadian exporters capitalized on this gap, integrating environmental audits directly into their operations, so that by the time their wheat reached foreign ports, it arrived pre-certified and accompanied by exhaustive documentation. All of this unfolded against the backdrop of shifting political winds in Washington. Trade policy became a tool for broader political leverage, sometimes targeting allies as much as rivals. For foreign buyers, it created the perception that agricultural exports could be weaponized in future disputes. In private conversations, some importers admitted they could no longer separate U.S. wheat from U.S. politics, a dangerous association in a business where predictability is king. Meanwhile, competitors were not merely waiting for U.S. missteps, they were innovating. Canada, in particular, transformed its wheat industry from a dependable supplier into a precision-driven export machine. Farms invested in advanced breeding programs to match grain characteristics with specific foreign markets. Logistics companies synced harvest schedules with overseas production cycles, eliminating bottlenecks. Digital tracking systems allowed buyers to verify a shipment's quality, origin, and carbon footprint within hours. This wasn't just about selling wheat, it was about selling certainty. Australia, too, seized its moment. While its production scale could not match the US or Canada, it positioned itself as a premium supplier to Asian markets. Australian producers marketed not just their compliance with low glyphosate thresholds, but their alignment with regional trade agreements that guaranteed smoother customs clearance. In markets like South Korea and the Philippines, that combination proved potent. The shift in buying behavior was also cultural. For decades, many foreign importers had deep personal and institutional ties to U.S. suppliers, relationships forged through trade missions, agricultural fairs, and decades of mutually beneficial deals. But as new generations took over in purchasing offices, loyalty was no longer rooted in tradition. Younger procurement managers, facing heightened corporate accountability for supply chain risks, evaluated suppliers through data, not history. And the data increasingly favored America's competitors. Inside the United States, the consequences rippled far beyond the farm gate. Rural economies that had relied on steady grain exports saw freight companies cut routes, processing facilities reduce shifts, and ancillary businesses, from equipment dealers to fertilizer suppliers, tightened their belts. The slowdown wasn't just seasonal, it was structural. Storage facilities in Kansas, Nebraska, and North Dakota filled to capacity, forcing some operators to lease additional space or turn farmers away. In a few stark cases, grain was dumped or destroyed, not because it was unfit for sale, but because moving it was no longer financially viable. Even domestic politics began to feel the strain. Farming communities, already navigating thin margins, pressed lawmakers for intervention. Some pushed for more aggressive trade diplomacy, others for subsidies to offset lost market share. But federal responses tended to focus on short-term relief, emergency payments, low-interest loans, without addressing the long-term competitive disadvantages that had taken root. Global buyers noticed the lack of structural reform. In conversations with trade analysts, importers often expressed skepticism that the U.S. could or would resolve its reliability issues quickly. "You can't just lower your price and think that fixes everything," one European mill executive remarked. "We need a supplier who delivers the same quality, on time, every time." If Canada can do it, why can't the US? That sentiment crystallized into a quiet but decisive shift in procurement strategies. Instead of treating American wheat as the default, buyers began treating it as one option among many, an option increasingly weighed down by risk. Contracts that had once been renewed automatically were now open to competitive bidding, with U.S. offers losing not on price but on trust. The transformation was starkest in markets that had long been considered unshakable. In Mexico, mills once configured exclusively for U.S. wheat began experimenting with blends from Canadian and Argentine grain. In France, artisan bakers reported that the switch to Canadian flour was virtually seamless, if not in some cases an improvement. In South Korea, food manufacturers retooled production lines to accommodate different grain properties, a costly step that nonetheless freed them from dependence on U.S. suppliers. By mid-2025, the U.S. found itself in a position it had not faced in living memory, as a challenger in markets it once dominated. Rebuilding that dominance would require more than competitive pricing or marketing campaigns. It would demand a re-engineering of the entire export system, from farm-level practices to federal trade policy, to restore the trust that had quietly but decisively shifted elsewhere. By the latter half of 2025, the reality had settled in. The United States was no longer the unchallenged anchor of the global wheat trade. What had once been a matter of routine commerce had become a case study in how geopolitical dynamics, domestic policy shifts, and evolving market expectations could converge to erode decades of dominance. For U.S. agriculture, the challenge ahead was not simply reclaiming lost sales, it was redefining its value proposition in a world where dependability had overtaken price as the ultimate currency. The geopolitical implications were significant. In past decades, American wheat exports often played a quiet but strategic role in diplomacy. Supplying staple grains to allies built goodwill, deepened economic interdependence, and reinforced Washington's influence in regions where food security was a priority. Now, as buyers from Mexico to South Korea forged closer ties with Canada, Australia, and Argentina, that soft power was dispersing. Grain contracts, once a discrete instrument of foreign policy, were being inked elsewhere, shifting not only trade flows but also the subtle levers of international alignment. Canada's ascent in this space was more than opportunistic. Ottawa recognized that reliable food supply could underpin broader strategic partnerships and invested accordingly. Grain terminals were modernized, inspection protocols standardized, and trade envoys dispatched to reassure buyers that Canadian exports were insulated from the political turbulence that sometimes roiled U.S. markets. This approach resonated in capitals where the specter of sudden tariff hikes or politically motivated export controls was increasingly viewed as a strategic vulnerability. For the U.S., the erosion of this agricultural advantage posed a long-term diplomatic risk. Countries that had once relied on American wheat not only restructured their supply chains, but also built new channels of political and economic cooperation with alternative suppliers. The shift was subtle, but in international relations, such subtleties often lay the groundwork for larger realignments. If the U.S. could no longer guarantee stable grain flows, what other areas of cooperation might come into question? Inside the American heartland, the response was complex. Some producers, particularly larger operations with resources to adapt quickly, began exploring ways to meet the stricter standards and technological demands of the new market landscape. This included investing in precision agriculture to better track pesticide usage, adopting advanced storage systems to preserve grain quality, and partnering with private logistics firms to reduce transit delays. Yet these initiatives were uneven. Smaller farms, already stretched thin, struggled to finance such upgrades, leaving them vulnerable to being priced out of premium markets entirely. The policy debate in Washington reflected these tensions. Agricultural lobbies pushed for trade missions and targeted negotiations to win back lost markets, but they also pressed for domestic reforms. Streamlined border procedures, consistent tariff policy, and investment in port infrastructure. Critics argued that the U.S. had focused too much on short-term relief for farmers, while neglecting the structural issues that made American exports less attractive in the first place. If we keep treating this as a seasonal slump, one trade analyst warned, we'll wake up to find we've lost a generation of buyers for good. Meanwhile, the market itself continued to evolve. Buyers had grown accustomed to the digital tools, transparency, and proactive service offered by competitors. Canadian shipments came with real-time quality data and environmental compliance reports. Australian exporters provided predictive delivery windows tied to factory schedules. In this new environment, the traditional selling points of U.S. wheat, volume capacity, competitive pricing, and historic reliability no longer stood out. Without matching these enhanced services, American suppliers risked being viewed as offering a commodity product in a premium market. Restoring U.S. credibility would require a multi-pronged strategy. First, consistency had to return, not just in grain quality, but in the policies governing its export. Foreign buyers needed assurance that a shipment contracted today would not be subject to unexpected tariffs, documentation changes, or border delays tomorrow. Second, the U.S. would need to adopt the same kind of integrated, technology-driven verification systems that competitors had mastered. Real-time tracking, environmental certification, and supply chain transparency were no longer luxuries. They were prerequisites. Third, there was the matter of relationships. While personal ties between U.S. suppliers and foreign buyers still existed, they had been strained by years of uncertainty. Rebuilding trust would take more than trade shows and diplomatic dinners. It would require a sustained period of performance, shipments arriving on time, standards met without exceptions, and commitments honored without renegotiation. Only through repeated reliability could the perception of American wheat as a risky bet begin to fade. The stakes extended beyond agriculture. In an interconnected economy, the credibility of one export sector can influence perceptions of an entire nation's trading posture. If U.S. wheat could be disrupted by policy volatility, might semiconductors, machinery, or other key exports face similar risks? For buyers managing complex supply chains, such questions could influence procurement decisions far beyond the grain market. By year's end, some in Washington were beginning to frame the challenge not as a crisis, but as a chance to modernize. The global wheat trade was moving toward a model defined by precision, traceability, and political neutrality. The U.S. could either adapt to that model or resign itself to a reduced role in the very markets it had helped build. The opportunity was there, but so was the risk of permanent decline. In the quiet towns of Kansas, Nebraska, and North Dakota, the debate in Washington often felt distant. Farmers watched storage bins overflow, barges leave ports half-loaded, and trains run on reduced schedules. For them, the problem was not abstract. It was the difference between passing their farms to the next generation or selling out entirely. Many had already seen neighbors exit the business, unable to weather the combination of falling demand and rising costs. And yet, amid the uncertainty, there were glimpses of possibility. A handful of cooperatives began pooling resources to invest in compliance upgrades and direct marketing to foreign buyers. Some partnered with Canadian firms to learn best practices in export logistics. These efforts were small in scale, but hinted at a path forward, a U.S. wheat industry that embraced precision and transparency, not as concessions to foreign demands, but as competitive advantages in their own right. Whether such change could take root quickly enough remained uncertain. The markets the U.S. had lost were unlikely to return without proof, delivered over months and years, that American wheat could once again be counted on as the standard. In the meantime, ships continued to leave Canadian, Australian, and Argentine ports, carrying not just grain, but the trust that once belonged to the United States. If history offered any lesson, it was this. In global trade, reputation moves slowly but decisively. Once lost, it can take decades to rebuild. The question now was whether the U.S. had the vision and the discipline to do just that.